This hearing of the Accountability and Administrative Review Committee is now called to order. Our hearing today will be focused on contracting amidst this emergency. Thank you, members, for joining us. Before we get started on the subject at hand, let me touch on some logistics and safety items for everyone who's here in the chamber with us and also listening at home. So due to the current stay-at-home order, we are practicing physical distancing here in the chamber and throughout the Capitol building. So we are only able to have a limited number of people watch and participate in the hearing in person. We have a few different options for public comment today, and as we get to the end of our hearing, we'll be opening this up for public comment, and I'll review the details at that point. We are having a physically distant in-person hearing. In this space, we can accommodate our members, a minimal contingent of staff, and a limited number of the public and media, so we maintain 6 feet of spacing. There are also strict physical distancing protocols for the public to enter and leave the Capitol, and for those here today joining us for the hearing. I want to thank everyone for your forbearance with us as we implement these methods to continue to serve the people of the state of California while ensuring that we are being safe and responsible and practicing distancing. This is, as we know, an unprecedented crisis. California has taken truly extraordinary steps to combat COVID-19. Under the governor's leadership, we together are meeting this crisis, flattening the curve, building surge capacity across California's healthcare system, and ensuring that we are in a position to reopen safely and responsibly. Over the past 2 months, a truly Herculean effort has been underway to build surge capacity across California's healthcare system, and this has included the procurement of millions and millions of units of personal protective equipment. Unfortunately, in the midst of this horrific crisis, there are those who have seen an opportunity for exploitation. And in the global rush for PPE, exploitation has been sadly rife, and fraud and abuse has been rampant. In recent weeks, the state has entered into contracts of more than $1.5 billion for PPE, and we have seen some 9-figure contracts that have fallen through or been canceled. And these incidents have raised questions about the robustness of our vetting protocols for state contracts in this emergency. So we are here today to really understand 4 things. Number 1, the lessons that have been learned as we have navigated this global race for personal protective equipment. Number 2, the protocols and controls that have been strengthened and adopted as a result of these lessons. Number 3, what issues and gaps still remain, and what are we doing to close those? And number 4, what is our strategy as we move forward in order to ensure that this mission-critical piece is in place in order for California to respond to COVID-19 and to move into recovery. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and also thank you for your tireless work and for your leadership as we have confronted this crisis and as we help California navigate truly uncharted waters. Before we hear from our panelists, I want to open it up for our members here to make their opening remarks. I just want to remind everyone, please, if we can keep our remarks to under 3 minutes, and I apologize if I yank your mic. We want to make sure that we've got plenty of time to focus on the topic at hand. Thank you to Chair Salas for joining us for this hearing. Thank you also to Chair Gray. I'd like to invite you to make your opening remarks first, and then invite my Vice Chair, Mr. Patterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to participate. Thank you to the members of the committee for allowing my participation on behalf of the Governmental Organization Committee. As it relates to today's agenda and state contracting, I'd like to say that there will always be critics who condemn the state for acting too quickly or not quickly enough. Without PPE and other supplies, people die. And so, speaking for myself, I land firmly on the side of acting quickly during a crisis and accepting a certain amount of risk as a result. I don't believe our role here today is to chastise, but rather we're here today to sterilize our mistakes with sunshine and public transparency. I look forward to listening to the panels and engaging in a dialogue with the executive and others on steps we can take going forward to do better and also to celebrate the success that we've had. So thank you again to the chairman, to the members, and I look forward to the hearing.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, for having this hearing and this oversight. I think it's vitally important. I appreciate you inviting me as the chair of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. Obviously, the articles and the media accounts have generated a lot of interest from a lot of members from both houses on this topic that we will explore later today. And it's, it's incumbent upon us as legislators to provide transparency and accountability at a time like this and ask the vital questions of how do we make sure that we're still ensuring accountability and transparency even in an unprecedented crisis like this? What have we done in past crises? What, when we had fires, or name the emergency that we've had in the state of California, which procurement guidelines do we still follow? How did we ensure that the public dollar was still being well spent? And so I'm looking forward to today's hearing, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this hearing, and I look forward to the comments from today and everyone. And this is an unprecedented time, and I do want to say that I believe the governor's led at this moment. He's met the moment, like he likes to say. And so I look forward to bringing sunshine to this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to be a part of this and also to have a couple of opening remarks. The first thing I want to do is to, I think, send out some kudos where kudos are due, particularly to the State Treasurer, Fiona Ma. I think she has done a remarkable job, particularly in one of the more difficult and what some have termed sort of a fishy contract. And as a result, this Blue Flame deal, we'll probably hear more about it, 100 million N95 masks. There were bankers involved that saw some real fishy things going on. The California Treasurer did some really good work, looked into this as well, and really did her job well. And then she called the governor's office and said there is something fishy going on here. So I want to commend people who have taken on the responsibility of being a watchdog and taken on the responsibility of doing their due diligence. This is a good example of it. But we do have a collection of contracts that either have borderline failed or have failed. Between $500 million with Blue Flame, $1 billion with BYD, $800 million with Bear Mountain. That's nearly $3 billion in contracts with serious difficulties. And so I have 2 or 3 questions that I'd like to ask later on to flesh out some of the concerns that I think some of us have about this, and appreciate the opportunity of being a part of this. As my friend from Central California pointed out, this difficult duty at a time when we need to have some clarity, but we also need accountability. And so we have an opportunity, thankfully, to take a look at what we've done, obviously look at it and say, well, that was a kind of a goof, but also figure out ways that we don't make those goofs again going forward. And the fundamental thing I think we're trying to achieve out of all of this is to get the resources to quality companies that know what they're doing and that can perform on their contracts to get these PPEs into the hands of people that need them the most. What we can't have is another $3 billion of iffy contracts. And I think this is an opportunity for us to do some of the due diligence and some of the accountability and some of the questions that we were elected to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members who would like to make opening remarks? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and begin with our first panel, Director Ghilarducci. Thank you again for being here.
All right, well, thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today about the state's response to the COVID-19 global pandemic, particularly the state's emergency procurement and distribution of life-saving personal protective equipment, or as we have come to know it, PPE. This has really been the largest disaster logistics and commodity distribution operation in the history of our state, dwarfing all previous disaster operations. As you're aware, and as has been reported almost nonstop by the media, the world media, this pandemic almost immediately caused and continues to cause a worldwide shortage of PPE, with healthcare delivery systems, governments, and private sector businesses simultaneously competing for scarce resources, particularly N95 masks. No government, including our own federal government, has been spared from this. In the early days of the pandemic, we were confronted with models and projections that indicated our medical infrastructure was at great risk of being overrun. PPE was in critically short supply, and medical providers were raising the alarm that they had insufficient stockpiles. Without adequate PPE, medical providers would likely become infected themselves, reducing the capacity of the healthcare system when we needed it most. States were placed in a terrible position of competing against each other, against our own federal government, and with governments around the world for the same precious resources. The vast majority of production of PPE occurs in China, with some specific items in Italy, both epicenters of major virus outbreaks and impacts. In fact, in China, the scale and spread of the virus resulted in either the shutdown of the majority of PPE manufacturing or major disruption in the supply chain directly. This included companies that manufactured the N95 masks, surgical masks, goggles, gowns, face shields, and gloves. And in Italy, the province where the outbreak was most severe was where the world's production of critically necessary swabs for testing were manufactured. And while we were in close contact with domestic suppliers, the majority depended on those foreign sources of manufacturing that I just mentioned and materials, and they were either unable to fill orders or were not able to start supplying the quantities we needed until fall of 2020. As well, our normal state suppliers of PPE that we have on contract had no access to N95s or most of the other commodities. By late March, following review and assessment of worst-case scenario modeling and associated sustained PPE need, we were able to set a target goal of purchasing 500 million N95 masks, 400 million surgical masks, 200 million face shields, 1 billion nitrile glove sets, and 100 million gowns. This would be to supply our hospital care systems, our responders, our senior care facilities, et cetera. At the same time, the number of N95 masks we had been able to source was less than 1 million. We were already seeing at that time prices on average of $6 to $7 per mask, with as high as $12 per mask. I want to repeat that, $6 to $7 per mask, as high as $12 per mask. This was not unique to California. This was all throughout the United States. Hundreds of vendors were calling whomever they could in the State Operations Center, as well as many of our elected leaders, including maybe some of you at the local, state, and federal levels, all saying they had a line on supplies and could deliver immediately. It has been said that this was the Wild Wild West. It was actually the Wild Wild World. The market was beyond volatile. The state had very little leverage to bargain with. Just as we were notified of a potential source and the source appeared legitimate, it was lost to another buyer. Given the overwhelming global need, it was a seller's market, and the sellers were dictating negotiable terms, including advance payments and other terms to which the state would not normally agree. I think it would help to provide some context as we got up to this point so that you could understand the enormity of the situation. In January, as COVID-19 caused the entire city of Wuhan in the Hubei province of China to quarantine, the state of California was noticed by the U.S. State Department of the need to activate the pre-established repatriation plan. California rose to meet the need when the State Department began repatriation flights to bring American citizens home. Cal OES activated the State Operations Center and worked with the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services Agency, and other federal organizations and state agencies to assist and coordinate the repatriation of the U.S. citizens back into California. Repatriation flights landed at March Air Force Base, Travis Air Force Base, and Marine Corps Station Miramar in late January and early February. California served as the gateway for thousands of Americans to return home safely. This required close coordination on the state's part with not only multiple federal and state agencies and departments, but also local fire and law enforcement, public health, the emergency management community, to provide the necessary logistical needs, such as appropriate sheltering and medical support for the repatriated citizens who were placed under quarantine upon arrival. As well, the U.S. government issued travel advisories for China, which resulted in tens of thousands of travelers immediately returning to the U.S., with almost all passing through or ending up in California. On February 1st, there were 6 confirmed positive COVID-19 cases in California. Throughout the month of February, the California Department of Public Health, in conjunction with the California Health and Human Services Agency, continued to monitor cases and work with local public health departments on contact tracing in the state. In late February, the state enhanced its capabilities dedicated to COVID-19 response after the first case of community transmission in the state occurred. And I do have in front of you a timeline to give you some context of that as I'm talking. On March 4th, the governor then declared a state of emergency statewide to build on the work already underway by the state and engage all levels of government in anticipation of the higher rates of COVID-19 infection that we expected. At the same time, resource requests for PPE were already accelerating, prompting the State Operations Center to begin distributing the 21 million N95 masks we had in our reserve. Then on March 6th, Cal OES received notification from the Health and Human Services Agency that the Grand Princess cruise ship was heading back to the state of California from Hawaii. The Grand Princess, normally ported in San Francisco, initially went to Mexico before coming back to California to offload and pick up passengers before again setting sail to Hawaii. The notice was that there were an unknown number of sick people on the ship. California supported the CDC and the Health and Human Services Agency with several high-profile sorties, transporting medical staff and necessary PPE out to the Grand Princess while still at sea. This included testing of staff and passengers on board and several evacuations of sick individuals. Following an extensive effort involving multiple levels of government, we were able to secure a plan for the ship to berth at a secure location at the Port of Oakland to ensure the passengers, 21 of them, of which had been tested positive for COVID-19, could disembark safely and receive medical treatment. The first passengers disembarked on March 9th, and the last passenger disembarked on March 16th. All passengers, including all other U.S. citizens and foreign nationals, quarantined at Travis Air Force Base, Miramar Air Station, and other alternative care sites established by the state to ensure there was no COVID-19 spread into the community before returning home. This was a major operation in its own right, and it demanded an extensive requirement for California to provide large quantities of PPE and medical personnel and logistics support to the U.S. Health and Human Services Agency. As COVID-19 continued to spread on March 7th, the governor announced that gatherings of 250 or more should be rescheduled or canceled, and that gatherings of individuals who were at higher risk for severe illness from COVID-19 should be limited to no more than 10 people, while also following social distancing guidelines. On March 16th, the California Department of Public Health issued guidance recommending that adults over 65 years old and those who have compromised immune systems or serious chronic medical conditions self-quarantine at home. On March 19th, the governor issued the stay-at-home order urging all non-essential Californians to remain home, a first state in the country to do so. On March 22nd, then, the governor requested and the president approved a major disaster declaration for California for direct federal assistance, emergency protective measures, and public assistance. Again, California was the first state to request and receive a major presidential disaster declaration. The same week, following request by the state to the U.S. Health and Human Services Agency, California received its initial allotment of PPE from the Strategic National Stockpile. This allotment, however, was only 25% of what was expected. And of that allotment was short in quantity. This allotment consisted of only 358,381 N95 masks, 853,730 surgical masks, 162,565 face shields, 132,544 surgical gowns, 678 coveralls, 741,941 glove sets. Throughout the ensuing weeks, the state continued to request for our full allotment of the national stockpile, and in a more timely fashion than what the first allotment came in at, as we were already falling behind on availability of PPE. In all, the state only received, throughout the whole time, only 75% of our total allotment. As referenced, the total allotment of the SNS should include the following: 25 million N95s, 10 million surgical masks, 600,000 gowns, 600,000 face shields, 600,000 gloves, 300,000 goggles, 100,000 coveralls. And again, in the end, we only received 75% of this allotment. The national stockpile also, the SNS also being short on expected PPE quantities, spoke to the PPE shortage challenge that the federal government itself was also facing, and their challenge of sourcing commodities in a timely fashion. While California was working to secure PPE, our own federal government, unbeknownst to us, had embarked on their own strategic approach. They entered into an agreement with several of the nation's largest medical supply companies. They launched what has come to be known as Operation Airbridge. The operation, which is ongoing today, consisted of the federal government utilizing DoD contract aircraft and buyers to scour PPE manufacturers in China to obtain as much PPE as possible. The U.S. government would then bring the commodities back to the U.S. to distribute it in the following manner: 50% to the medical supply company to sell to their customers, predominantly hospitals; 20% to the medical supply company to sell to others, individuals and organizations that are looking for PPE, with priority to hotspot portions in the country, which at the time was New York, New Jersey, Michigan area, and 30% to FEMA for distribution via the Strategic National Stockpile. This program, while just now starting to ease some of the backlog of PPE requests in hospitals specifically, literally compounded the difficulties states were facing in obtaining PPE through sourcing. What was left could only be obtained in the Asian market. Ostensibly, what was left could only be obtained in the Asian market was now almost 100% unavailable. In addition to the challenges we faced with ongoing limited commodities that required extensive navigation, we saw amongst vendors fraud, promises not kept, overstated capabilities, and an overwhelming number of individuals and companies working hard to take advantage of the situation. Further, we were also seeing cases where states were successfully getting PPE orders filled, only to have those shipments diverted or orders superseded by the U.S. government. We, in fact, in California, lost shipments of swabs and shields to this situation, and we have seen diversions of 3M N95 mask orders to the U.S. government. Lastly, given the amount of volatility in the PPE market and the amount of criticism the Chinese government was getting, the Chinese government started to shut down PPE manufacturers and stop shipping commodities out of China. Again, in this circumstance, we lost several critical N95 orders as a result of this. Even with the tremendous pressure of all this going on, with the need to rapidly move to get PPE for life-saving operations in real time, in contrast to what has been reported in the media, the procurement team used the experience they have and has ensured why no money has been lost, and we have only paid for what we have or what we will receive, in comparison to other states that forwarded funds and have potentially lost them. Let me be clear. With the massive pressure to procure life-saving equipment, the thousands of offers coming in 24/7, the promises of deliveries not met, with our extensive vetting that was in place at the time, our safety net that we use through normal disaster operations and procurement, but then now having to do this literally on steroids, I guess you could say, with the amount of time frames and requirements we had. It was really a miracle in many ways that there wasn't more challenges that we had. Excuse me, let me drink some water here. Move my mask. I haven't done too many of these hearings with a mask on, so now we know how the doctors and nurses must feel being in these masks all day. I'd like to highlight an example of one of the challenges we were confronted with that resulted in us enhancing our existing vetting process in real time, given the circumstances of the new norm that we were facing with regards to the requirements at hand. And this is one that was referenced earlier in the opening comments by Assembly member. On March 23rd, one of the hundreds of leads coming in that day to Cal OES, we received and referred a referral about a company called Blue Flame and forwarded the company to DGS, serving in its role as our adjudicator, what we call Emergency Support Function 7, to vet, as it had done countless times. The vendor indicated that they had 100 million N95 masks in the Port of Long Beach. The DGS team asked the California-based owner questions to assess whether the company actually had the product and could deliver it. The caller confirmed that he had masks and offered, again, the 100 million N95 masks. The caller provided a quote at $4.76 per mask, which at the time was one of the lowest we had seen to date compared to purchases that had been made at $8.50 and $5.50 and $5. The caller provided product specifications that met state requirements. The caller provided a shipping schedule. The caller provided information on the manufacturer. The individual represented himself as a company owner who indicated that he was a California resident who had a business in good standing registered with the Secretary of State. The company was a U.S. company using an American bank. The caller also indicated that they would require advance payment, which was the standard at the time that was being required on anyone supplying direct supplies from China, given everything that I had mentioned before. Again, in the context of all that was going on and the need to move swiftly, as well as the concern to obtain the necessary PPE, that the vendor appeared to have the supply at a good price, and given the information obtained, reviewed, that did not depict any derogatory information about the company, the team moved forward with the order. As well, the team at the same time, however, was balancing that order with an order with domestic 3M Corporation at the same time to determine whether they could source a similar number of masks. The inclination of the team was to procure the masks through 3M. However, 3M came back and indicated that at the time they could not deliver the product, and to this day, they are still having trouble delivering products. Of the multiple checks and balance, this was one that was identified ultimately by the bank as we did wire money on this one, appeared to be legitimate, and the bank's normal vetting process caught it, reported it to the state, and reported it to the state, to the treasurer, and to Department of General Services, literally simultaneously. To date, we have not actually canceled this order as it remains open pending an investigation. This one is an example of the countless number of activities that were going on that represented some form of misrepresentation or possibly fraud in a time when our public safety, all of us, were responding to be able to source material and people taking advantage of it. In all, given the thousands of commodities vetted, the tremendous pressure to source, and the significant amount of vendors that we were dealing with, there were ultimately just a few that required us to either cancel the contract or seek reimbursement. Throughout the entire endeavor, and we're talking about 10,000s of orders, to date, not one dime of taxpayer dollars has been lost. It has become very clear to us that given the circumstances, the volatile competitive market fueled by scarce resources, the limited availability of PPE, and the unpredictable Chinese government, along with all of this activity that was going on by people who were just nefarious, that we needed to continue down a path like this. Ultimately, our ultimate objective was getting PPE, and our continuing down the path where we were going one-offs and being able to pull from one vendor or another was unsustainable. We needed a more strategic approach. We leveraged the systems and concepts we have utilized in many previous disasters to develop a multi-pronged strategy to build a more manageable, reliable, and sustainable pipeline to meet the needs now and for the duration of the event, as well as prepare for the needs that are necessary to reopen the economy, as new industries will need to utilize PPE in order to mitigate any potential COVID-19 infection. We set a path to build a sustainable, reliable capability that would move us from a defensive position to an offensive one. This included the following. 1, we would continue to work with trusted NGOs, partners, vendors, and seek donations to source commodities. 2, we would identify and establish a sustainable and reliable pipeline of PPE, predominantly for N95 and surgical masks. In essence, this would be an investment in a manufacturing capability that would be dedicated to specifically California. 3, to work with FEMA and DoD to source and bring into the state the capability to disinfect and repurpose N95 masks. We move forward with this strategy. We have continued to source through vendors and NGOs or continue to take donations for a number of necessary commodities. As well, we entered into an agreement with BYD Motors, a California-based company with significant manufacturing capabilities in China. We have been confident in BYD's abilities to source materials. In fact, BYD has been providing surgical masks to us now with more than 32 million delivered. These masks have been critical to helping us open our state again. The other part of this contract was a sustainable pipeline of scarce N95 masks. This portion of the contract is contingent upon BYD obtaining NIOSH certification. This is a national certification, safety certification. While we expected this certification in early May, which is, you have to work with the federal government, and we work closely with FEMA and the FDA on this effort, we learned that the certification would not be provided in May. We are now expecting it at the end of May or the first week in June. If the certification is not obtained, California gets 100% of its fund back. The $245 million that was returned to California, as outlined in the contract, and the contract has been released, the provisions of the contract are clear, specifically outlines all the safety provisions that have been put in place in the best interest of California. That $245 million was if they did not meet the May timeline for N95 certification, that would be reimbursed to the state, and it has. As well, in working to build a sustainable pipeline, we sought the engagement, innovation, and manufacturing power within the state of California to have companies retool production lines to make, at scale, needed commodities or services. This has been a successful endeavor, with hundreds of companies now procuring or producing necessary items. Some examples include Bloom Energy in San Jose, retooled to repair ventilators. Anheuser-Busch and Bayer in Los Angeles retooled to produce hand sanitizer. St. John Knits and Fabrics in Los Angeles retooled to manufacture gowns and face coverings. Oakley Sunglasses in Orange County retooled to produce face shields. Virgin Orbit Rocket in Long Beach retooled to produce ventilators. Untribe Manufacturing, garment manufacturing, specializes in Los Angeles, retooled to produce cloth face masks and face coverings and reusable gowns, and etc. There's many of these. The third prong included obtaining a capability to disinfect and repurpose N95 masks. Through partnerships with FEMA, the state leveraged new innovative technology to safely reuse PPE. On April 20th, the first Battelle unit arrived in Burbank. The FDA issued emergency use authorization for the emergency use of this critical care decontamination system for use in decontaminating N95 respirators. The Battelle unit can decontaminate one mask up to 20 times. The unit can clean 10,000 masks at a time and up to 80,000 masks per day. A second Battelle unit is now located in Fremont, California. The situation continues to be uncertain. Domestic production is ramping up, but is not yet sufficient to meet all the needs. At the same time, exports from China continue to be restricted by the Chinese government and may further restrict in the future. Since the beginning of this event, we have worked tirelessly to meet the tremendous ongoing demand of our healthcare workers, hospital first responders, and government agencies in a timely and proactive way as possible. It is important to understand that all of the activity around PPE has taken and continues to take place in a rapidly evolving dynamic environment. However, the logistics team in the State Operations Center continues to work procurement and distribution of PPE, as well as build the state's preparedness to fulfill PPE during future outbreaks. This strategy supports the reopening of California by providing a state solution to address immediate unmet needs for PPE by creating a pipeline for jurisdictions and private sectors to procure their own PPE. As of Saturday, we have issued orders for approximately 326 million N95s, 30 million KN95 masks, 307 million other kinds of masks, 41 million face shields, 304 million nitrile gloves, 60 million gowns, 5.4 million pairs of coveralls, 12 million pairs of goggles, 2 million vinyl gloves, 1.1 million shoe covers and 1 million bouffant caps. The total cost of these items, $2,141,691,000. As well, to help manage the further vet the incoming offers, the day before the governor issued the stay-at-home order, we announced the launch of the state's COVID-19 website, covid19.ca.gov, to serve as a one-stop shop for information on COVID state and federal resources. Following on that, Cal OES set up a contributors work group to manage the influx of potential vendors offering to sell medical equipment to the state for the COVID-19 response, and a large donations offered to the state. Leaders from all state agencies were receiving emails and calls regarding new supply lines for PPE. Between March 17th and April 2nd, the state of California received 2,852 individual contribution offers, with over 73% of them representing vendors. During this time, Cal OES, the Department of Technology, the Department of General Services began working together to build an internal system to intake, validate, vet, and procure supplies during a disaster. This system was built with generous donation from Salesforce and will be used in all future disasters for emergency procurement and statewide donation management. Up until this point, the state of California donations management was coordinated on the local level with state support. This new system will allow the state to take a more active coordination role in donation collecting during all major disasters. The State of California COVID-19 Medical Supplies Contributions Portal was officially launched on April 4th. There have been over 7,700 submissions received to the State of California Medical Supply Contributions Portal to this date. As soon as the submission is received, the vendor receives an automatic email acknowledgement receipt of the submission. The request is then pushed to the vetting group consisting of the following groups: contributions group, a validations group, and a procurement group. Once the notice of interest is entered into the contributions working group, the group reviews the submission within 24 hours of receiving, determines if it is a unique submission, has the person submitted the exact same information in the past, if they have filled out the forms properly. If the vendor has not provided enough information about the business or the resource they are offering, they will be disqualified and receive an email at that time saying that they have been disqualified, and encourage them to resubmit with information requested. If the vendor has provided enough information, the contributions working group will assign the vendor to the validation group to validate that the resource will meet state specifications. This vendor will receive an email stating that they will be contacted for more information about their specific resource. Information requested includes business information, tax ID number, year of incorporation, etc. If a resource is moved to the validation group, it is reviewed by one of 4 units within the validation group, consisting of subject matter experts from the Department of Public Health and or the Emergency Medical Services Authority to review the medical supplies. These 4 units are the ventilator unit, the testing validation unit, the CDPH validation unit for PPE, and the medical equipment unit. The validation group then prioritizes the review of the resources based on what the vendor says, the quality of the product, and the lead time for shipment, meeting the procurement goals. Each validation group utilizes appropriate specifications criteria associated with their product line for reviewing supplies, and all reach out to the vendor to request additional information on the commodity as required. Based on their review, they will either disqualify the resource or send it to the procurement group. They will send an email at the time stating the outcome of their review. The procurement group then reviews the validation group's assessment and prioritizes their review of the vendor based on the state's goals, and they reach out to the vendor to discuss purchase terms and request more information about the vendor. Based on the outcome of the discussions, they will either pursue the resource or disqualify, and will send an email of such. In fact, as well as a component to the state's enhanced vetting process, we incorporated procedures and ongoing checks and balances in real time for the procurement group to access and coordinate with in partnership with local, state, and federal law enforcement, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Department of Homeland Security to try to vet as much of these groups as possible. This strategy is aligned with the governor's 6 indicators and 4 stages for reopening the state. It is informed by specific resource requests received by the medical health, social services, and child care, government, agriculture, transportation, and education sectors that capture prior efforts to secure PPE burn rates of existing PPE and immediate needs to support operations. This strategy will be further refined as PPE requirements from additional sectors include manufacturing, construction, food service, etc., including government. By the way, today we were able to, at the request of this body, move over 40,000 surgical masks so that this body could move forward with future government operations. These projections are also based on what we understand to be federal efforts to directly provide PPE to healthcare facilities via existing healthcare distributors, as well as through direct shipments to skilled nursing facilities. Distribution of strategy for state contract N95s, procedure masks, and cloth masks includes a process for prioritizing and distributing PPE to health and non-health sectors during the emergency phase. The second phase includes a leveraged procurement agreement for those sectors to purchase their own. Our Department of General Services is working on building the capability for local governments and other entities to be able to identify and procure PPE on their own. Lastly, they will provide guidance to the public and employers on the type and use of PPE and how that PPE aligns with reopening roadmap strategies and existing research projects and needs. In closing, let me just reiterate a few points. California has been responding to COVID-19 since mid to late January, when the repatriation efforts of U.S. citizens took place through our state. This allowed us to engage in advanced planning efforts with local, state, and federal partners to appropriately manage the rate of infection in relation to other states, given the population, area, and size of California. Given the ongoing global shortage of PPE, California has still been able to receive and distribute nearly 46 million N95 masks, over 32 million surgical masks or procedure masks, over 1 million gowns, over 4 million face shields, and nearly 16 million glove sets. This is also inclusive of California developing its own direct supply chain of protective masks for the short term and the long term that will be necessary to allow for the reopening of our state, who may not be previously utilized a protective mask on a continual basis, but may be required post-COVID-19 environment. Given the tremendous interest in the status of PPE allocation and to ensure for transparency, we established 2 sections on the COVID-19 website dedicated to PPE. The first section, called County Maps, allows the reader to scroll over their respective county and see data analytics associated with COVID-19 cases, hospitals, and the quantity of PPE being distributed in that county. The second is called PPE Request and Distribution Process and is designed to describe how to secure PPE from the state stockpile for the various sectors that may need it. Examples of those sectors include health and medical, child care, senior care and assisted living, agriculture and farm workers, schools, transit and transportation, grocers and food service, and manufacturing. The site described how to better understand and navigate the system and the process to allow the request to obtain commodities. Lastly, there has been no money that the state has lost in any of these emergency procurements or transactions to date. The state has lost no money in any of these transactions or procurements to date, and that has been required as an undertaking during the COVID-19 response. And as I mentioned earlier, we have stuck in a number of additional checks and balance, including our engagement with our Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and the U.S. Attorney Office. With that, again, I appreciate the opportunity to provide these comments. Such a complex, very elaborate, fast-moving, and dynamic asymmetrical event that has really required all hands on deck. And I can't be prouder of the men and women who have dedicated themselves in the State Operations Center under tremendous conditions, working literally 24/7 to be able to source a cornerstone of our ability to respond, and that is PPE throughout the state. With that, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Update. Thank you, Director, for that update. Are there any questions from committee members? If you have a question, go ahead and pop your mic up. All right. Yep, Mr. Patterson.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to ask a couple of questions. You may have answered this. I just want to make sure. Where are we getting our N95 masks now? How many do we have? And do we know essentially where they are?
So let me take the first part of that. We get our N95 masks currently from a variety of sources. Some are being sourced from overseas, Asia market, where we can squeeze out small orders of N95, and most of the orders now are coming out are small. And when I say small, I'm talking in the less than million number, more in the hundreds of thousands. There have been some opportunities. The market is changing a little bit where we could get very small amounts of PPE. There's an Arizona company that is now working on purposing PPE, N95 masks, or with Honeywell, both organizations can only do small amounts, and they can only provide us with material in late June. We have, of course, as part of our agreement with BYD to supply 150 million N95 masks a month. And the contract is based upon the ability to get those masks in a very specific set of timeframes and can be canceled at any time we no longer need the masks. The masks, we also get some from FEMA. FEMA has been, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, 30% of the Operation Airbridge goes to FEMA for purposing in the national stockpile. And we have been able to get little bits, and I'm talking like in the 1 to 2 million over the course of time. As soon as we get these kind of PPE in, masks of all sorts and types, we turn them around and push them back out because we are still at a deficit in unfilled need for masks. Right now, I think in the stockpile we have, because we just got a big shipment of BYD surgical masks. By the way, the two parts of the BYD contract, one was N95 masks, sustainable, 150 million a month, and the other was surgical masks, just like the one I'm wearing, which was 50 million a month. They were able to actually accelerate those and move them to us almost 2 weeks in advance of the expected contract requirements, which allowed us to push those hard into the community. As soon as we get them in, we turn them around. This weekend, we pushed close to 11 million masks out to all different sorts of sectors, from transportation to schools to healthcare to you name it. Right now, we have about 1 million N95s sitting in our warehouse. We're expecting a shipment today, and it ebbs and ties constantly with regards to this PPE. How you can see where it goes, the way this works is that the requests are made up through a couple different ways. Most of the requests are come through the medical health system for N95s and surgicals, which are predominantly used for healthcare workers and first responders. They go to their medical health coordinator at the operational area or county level. They then, typically they have a little warehouse there. They typically try to fill those, but in this case, it comes right up to the state because they don't have anything in the warehouse. And once it's adjudicated, we fill out of the state warehouses down back to those public health departments at the county level, where they push them out to the various entities that make the request. You can see where all those go by going to the county map that I mentioned on the covid19.ca.gov website. And on there, you can go over the county and you can see specifically how many PPEs have been distributed out to the county. At the county level, the counties keep the track of who's in need of those and where those go. You know, like I say, right now, the big thing is we're still at a very tight N95 commodity, scarce resource. We're doing much better on the surgical mask because the sustainable, reliable pipeline that we put in place is delivering. And we're being able to push those out to the community as we speak.
Thank you. With respect to the N95 masks and the BYD contract, are you concerned that they may not be certified? And if they are not certified in a timely fashion, do you have a backup plan for providing the additional masks that the BYD contract called for?
That is a great question. Thank you. Within the provisions of the contract, specifically stated as a condition, is that the vendor needs to provide a NIOSH FDA certified N95 mask. That means that it's incumbent upon them to obtain that NIOSH certification. This is what happened in May. We expected them to have been able to get the N95 NIOSH certification in May. They had provisional certification by NIOSH, but in a secondary review by Underwriters Laboratories on behalf of FDA and NIOSH, they found some problems in the documentation with regards to the need to move that documentation forward on the spec sheets. They gave them a corrected action plan. They are actively working on that corrective action plan, and we fully expect that they'll be able to get the certification. The product materials in themselves had already been determined by NIOSH as being of quality, and we're asking for the highest quality N95 masks. There is, by the way, so you know, a variety of N95s, from N95s that run from 65 cents to N95s that run to $3.20 in the normal market. So they're all different kinds of N95s, and these are the ones that we were seeking with the highest quality. In the case of the May, and not meeting the May requirements, that's why they had to immediately wire back $254 million back because they did not meet that. If we do not have the second ones fail, we are where we are at with a number of other states and governments. We are continuing to actively source through our first prong strategy, and this is why we did a three-prong strategy. Just as a reminder, the first prong was working with NGOs and our normal vendor community to be able to provide N95s. The second one was through a pipeline, secure pipeline, and the third was through the Battelle unit, where we were disinfecting and recertifying those masks for use. We have entered into agreements with several hundred hospitals now, I couldn't tell you the exact number today, that are working with being able to collect their N95, who has used N95 masks, and move them forward through the disinfection process. That could disinfect up to 80,000 a day. But also understand that we have started to see a little bit of a slowing, still not completely met, but a little bit of a slowing in the N95 requirements by the hospital, because the major providers that have been sourced through the Airbridge, Operation Airbridge, are starting to provide those commodities directly to hospitals. And these are companies like McKesson and Cardinal, the normal companies that these hospitals normally work with. So a number of factors, again, in the market space are continuing to evolve and shift. We also are starting to see a little bit of a domestic production come around. And so our plan is that we will then pivot and use some of the other pronged approaches. We'll continue to use those pronged approaches. It's not consecutive, it's concurrently. But we thought about that as we went forward in the event that we would lose out. Well, the ultimate objective, of course, is to get those brand new high-end N95s in, and again, we're confident that we'll be able to get those.
Thank you. One more question, and it's two-part. Are there other similar no-bid, large-scale emergency contracts that the state has entered into that we do not know about or have not been publicly disclosed?
I believe all of the contracts that the State Operations Center has entered into have been made available, and there could be a contract that could be being worked as we speak right now, where things are happening constantly, 24/7 there. But I will tell you that I don't know of any large procurements at this point, because as for all the things I just mentioned, we've built in a much more stabilized effort, and the market itself is changing a little bit.
One final question, and I appreciate the Chair's indulgence. Are there any other contracts where there is taxpayer money floating around out there in jeopardy of non-performing contracts?
I'm a little, thanks for the question, can you clarify floating around out there?
Well, again, we have these contracts, money is sent, it's out there, and yet you have contracts that are in the midst of non-performance. In other words, are there others out there that might have failure issues like BYD?
Well, every contract, of course, has every vendor and every contractor, of course, in some form or fashion, could potentially fail in the delivery of their services. We have built into all of the contracts a requirement for immediate termination, and outside of only a couple of contracts, and really it's only a handful of contracts that we actually move money forward. All the money that all the contracts that we've entered into have all been a pay when receive the material. So we inspect, they deliver, they meet the delivery requirements, and it's the net 45 days or something like that we have in place that through the normal procurement process that we would pay those. It was only in a few very large, couple of these large contracts that were necessary to move forward early on that we actually moved money forward. And as I said, the actual money, only money that actually exchanged into where we're getting products back that we have not canceled or didn't lose any money is the BYD contract.
I'm finished. I appreciate it. Mark, I want to just say something personal. Some of us, we members who serve on accountability and also on audit committee and all, we have had some vocal concerns about divisions, departments, et cetera, in the state government. I want you to know that I personally appreciate very, very much what you have done, and you have also been very responsive and very helpful with respect to my district and the people who have concerns. We pass them along. You and your staff are very quick to respond, and you're doing a very, very good job in my neck of the woods, and I've appreciated it very much, Mark. Thank you for it.
Thank you, sir, very much. I appreciate that.
Mr. Medina.
Thank you. Is here today. I represent the 61st Assembly District, which includes Moreno Valley, where March Air Force Base is located, in the Inland Empire. And I am very happy to hear that the situation regarding the personal protective equipment has gotten better. In the first few days of the stay-at-home orders, the Inland Empire, specifically Riverside County on March 24th had asked for masks, and the administration pointed out that they had received 385,000 masks, when in reality, Riverside County only received 740 masks of the 385,000 that the administration said it had received. As a member of the Inland Empire Caucus, I know that with the situation that Riverside County faced was not too different from San Bernardino County as well. So I'd like to hear, if you would, what were the challenges throughout the state? I understand how difficult it was to get the equipment, but what were the challenges in the distribution of them? Because it seemed like different parts of the states received some when other parts of the state, Inland Empire, were not.
Well, thanks for the question, and let me just say that conceivably, it could be true, and I don't have the specifics in front of me for that case, but I will tell you that we collectively, all of us here, deal with pretty extensive disaster operations every year. It's always a one team, one fight effort. The legislature, us, the local governments, all working together. Typically, and we've got tried and true systems that we use, particularly in the area of logistics management and coordination and distribution and resource allocation. Typically, we do it where we've got even, a regional disaster. Maybe it's several counties. In this one, however, we had all 58 counties. Every city in those 58 counties. Every sector within those cities in those 58 counties demanding PPE in a format where we had very limited amounts to go around. Conceivably, it could have been that they made the order of 345. We thought we delivered it. Maybe we did. We course corrected. I do know that in the case of Riverside, at the same time, we were actively trying to move 2 field hospitals into the region, into Riverside County specifically. There was a lot of commodity movement going into Riverside, and I will just tell you that conceivably there could have been, the zig versus a zag on that, and it wasn't from purposely not holding PPE back, because I can tell you we pushed a lot into Riverside County, obviously based upon what the needs are. However, on balance, let me just say, and again, I need to look at this case specifically, but under these kind of conditions, there were many jurisdictions that requested quite a bit, but because of the scarcity of resources, we had to triage and prioritize who was going to get stuff and who wasn't. So I guess I would say I apologize if there was something there that didn't work quite right, but I will look into it, and I assure you that it wasn't done in a form of purposely not providing it. It could have been a lot of different reasons.
Thank you for that answer. And yeah, it just seemed like our part of the state wasn't receiving the equipment when other parts of the states were. So thank you.
Welcome.
Ray? You're going to ask your questions at the end. All right. Okay. Then I've got a couple of questions. So, kind of going from the most specific to more broad. So I think I, like everyone here, am very relieved to hear your affirmation that no taxpayer dollars have been lost and that actually the controls that exist have been effective. As you said with Blue Flame, that was a cautionary tale. You outlined some of the new evaluation and vetting procedures that have been implemented. Specific question, so for a contract of that size, now who is the signatory? Who would be the signing authority on a contract of that size?
So typically, you know, we delegate under what we use in the state under the emergency plan is what we call emergency support functions. There's 18 of them. Different agencies or departments have the primary responsibility for meeting the requirements. In this case, it's ESF 7, which is Resource and Commodity Management. The authority rests within the Department of General Services. In this case, it would be the director or his designee or her designee. Clearly, though, that said, and the way that goes, and it depends on where they're at. If we have an incident management team that's in the field, they may be delegated a certain number of authorities to procure. These big contracts, though, and there was only a few of them in this particular case, even as complex as this was, those were all discussed with me and with the director of DGS and with the Secretary of Government Operations and with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the director of CDPH, because these were all medically necessary devices. And so we wanted to make sure that those were all synced. Ultimately, in the case of BYD, I signed the agreement because it was you know, the way that it was all come together. That one was me. The other ones were done within the procurement, and the case for Blue Flame, I believe, was the Director of Department of General Services.
Okay, great. And I think there's been some reluctance, which the governor has explained about the willingness and the reasons for the reticence to release some of these contracts around PPE. I think if I heard you correctly responding to my colleague's question, you said now all of the contracts have been made public and have been shared with the legislature. Is that correct?
To the best of my knowledge,
okay.
That is. Can I clarify one thing, though? There was only one contract, though, that we specifically wanted to hold on releasing for the reasons that I sort of mentioned before, but this was the BYD contract, and it had to do predominantly with, it was such a critical pipeline of assets to us. We had a case where we specifically went to a California-based company. That was one of the reasons we approached them. We could reach out and literally touch them, which was an important piece in our vetting. They had a massive manufacturing capability in China that they were already repurposing to build out, and they were way ahead of the game, to build out PPE, and they had access to materials. Let me be clear. These surgical masks, anybody can make, for the most part, to the degree. N95s require a certain type of material, a certain kind of thing that filters surgically required masks. Only a couple places in the world where you can actually get the materials. And so Taiwan is one of those places where they were sourcing. They had a pipeline of those sources. So we entered into this agreement. We started working to build this, what we felt was just really a great contract and to be able to sustain this material. But we knew that the Chinese government and BYD was being besieged by not only a number of other states, they were being besieged by a number of other countries. And we didn't know, quite frankly, exactly how much the Chinese government had promised to, like Brazil and France and Italy and all these other countries, about giving PPE. We knew that China was breaking down and stopping manufacturing in their country. We knew that the virus outbreak in Wuhan had almost decimated their manufacturing capability because the people couldn't go to work. there's all these countries, all this stuff that may have been promised, and then here comes California, comes around the side corner here on a side tackle, and sets up this contract for 150 million masks a month. And that was our concern, that it would be intervened or shut down if we provided too much information. Our intention was always to release the contract. We felt very confident in the contract, but it was one of these things from a security perspective that we just wanted to wait a little bit. And certainly, you know, it became, you know, a big deal. And in the end, once the masks started rolling in, and we knew that the pipeline was sufficient, we knew that we could get it through customs, we knew that the planes would work, we knew all that stuff would happen, we felt comfortable in releasing the contract. All the rest of them, however, I think were just, you know, there was no provision of us holding any of those back.
Understood. Okay.
Hope that helps.
It does, yes. And just also understanding that this challenge is going to be with us for some time to come. And I think we all acknowledge that a sufficient supply of PPE is absolutely critical to being able to reopen this state and this economy. You spoke a bunch about the work that's been done to source suppliers. What, if anything, have we done to try to enroll some of our dormant California manufacturing capacity to try to pivot that to manufacturing, particularly the N95 masks that are so critical in such short supply?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. There's a company that, this is, again, even the companies N90, 3M, which is the, which we all know and have heard about, they're still having trouble sourcing materials and being able to deliver in large quantities. Plus, in their case, they have made commitments to the federal government, first and foremost, which has been challenging for us. But even Honeywell and then the company in Arizona, very small quantities. Here in California, I wanted to get my list here because there is one company called Advoik. It's a retail display company. It's in Santa Clara. And it is being retooled to produce N95 masks. And they do have a standing PO with us if they can get NIOSH certification, which they've applied to, and they're going through that process. They've got a standing PO with us. As soon as they get that NIOSH certification, we're going to be first in line to be able to get N95s for them. So we're all about, you know, just like, you know, the folks at Oakley who literally were making sunglasses and now they're making face shields. And we immediately did a PO for that with them, and we're getting, you know, millions of face shields from them. So where we can, California is so innovative. Of course, we have such great capabilities. We're using our biotech. You probably heard Gilead just recently came up with Risedivir, and that's a potential medication for COVID, you know, done here in California. We've been working very closely with them. And this is up and down the state. The governor did bring together a consortium of business leaders and organizations. We've got web portals. Our Office of Non-Governmental and Private Sector Coordination has been reaching out to all these folks. And we've got thousands of ideas. And I could be happy to share with you the list of all the companies that have come together. And we're trying to leverage them as much as possible.
That would be wonderful. I think that would be useful for all of us. And one last question. So given just the scope and scale of the challenge that we've already experienced and that we anticipate going forward, do you think California needs a Defense Production Act?
So it's a great question. And right now, under the Emergency Services Act, the governor certainly has the authority to implement an equivalent to a Defense Production Act, as they call it at the federal level. I will tell you that we did talk about doing such a thing, and the governor moving forward. We were close to having that done, but what we found is that when the governor reached out and we brought all these business leaders together, and he went on press conference and talked about companies stepping up, we were just overwhelmed with the amount of interest, and so we just didn't think we needed to actually formalize something that we were already getting through the normal process. To be clear, though, is we do have, under the Emergency Services Act, under that authority that you have granted us, the governor can implement that, as necessary.
Okay, understood. And as we look forward, who's responsible for kind of leading this PPE charge? Is that still going to reside in your department and your authority, or is there a task force that's either going to be set up or has been set up to try to really focus on this issue?
Well, what we do, thanks for the question. When we deal with these big emergencies, we kind of break the various aspects that have responsibility into task forces, like schools task force or recovery task force or transportation. In this case, we did have a PPE, internal PPE task force. It is what that ESF 7, as I mentioned, Emergency Support Function 7, really does. But we added a number of additional entities. So we brought in, it was DGS and OES. It was Department of Public Health and Health and Human Services. It was CAL FIRE, FEMA. We brought in the FBI. There's a number of different agencies that GovOps that came in and built around to meet all the requirements that I've listed in my testimony. That entity will remain in place until this is passed. And to your point, this is something that's going to be ongoing for, at least the next year. To the level and degree of engagement will depend how much we can get PPE out. We at OES, the general way we do things in state operations during emergencies is we fill the gap. So really, we are going to try to and continue to work on building and filling the gap on the front end where you can't get the commodities through the normal process. Eventually, that normal process will stabilize, and we would expect local governments and others to start procuring through the normal process instead of having the state supply that to them. So when that happens, we're not really there yet. I could tell you it'll probably be another few weeks before we can get to that point.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Any questions from other members? So we're going to let the director go. So if there's questions you have for the director, we should ask him now, because then we'll hear from our other panelists. Okay, Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I said, I was going to go ahead and listen to all the panelists before putting the questions, but if the director is going to get back to work, certainly want to allow him to do that. Director Gorducci, nice to see you. Thank you for your continued efforts and all of the hard work the folks over at Cal OES are doing. I want to dive into, for a second, the kind of lessons learned, and I heard you say, there are lessons learned in some of these early contracts, and as I said in my opening statement, I think it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback in the sense of laying blame at folks' doorsteps. The reality is people's lives are on the line. The governor, folks in your department had to act quickly to make sure we could secure these supplies, and certainly a certain amount of risk is appropriate in acting quickly to ensure the safety. But certainly the Blue Flame incident kind of sticks out as some real odd stuff there. Could you walk me through kind of the lessons learned, how we're, what precautions are in place now? And one that comes to mind is who is authorized? I know you said the agency heads could procure the contracts. Well, have we limited that pool a great deal going forward?
I wouldn't characterize it as limiting the pool. I think that when we get into these large contracts, there's a lot of collaborative discussion as to whether we're going to move forward with these or not. In real time, there's so much happening. Now, in the time frame that we were talking about, it was literally, we were having a case where, we would get an opportunity and within minutes that opportunity was lost. It was challenging for all of us, even seasoned logistics specialists and emergency management personnel, to be able to adequately make sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, as much as we were possibly could be doing that in the timeframes that we were having. Extremely, extremely stressful on the part of everybody who wanted to make sure that, that we were doing the right thing. It's not usual for, you know, $800, $500 million contracts to be pushed through in these big events, except we have a big earthquake, or in the 18 fires and during the Camp Fire, we were moving some pretty big stuff through. The debris operations in 17 and 18 were significant. So we take a lot of things into consideration, including the ability to get reimbursement. And by the way, I didn't mention it in my testimony, but one thing we make sure of as we move forward, well, we don't make sure of it. It is one of those factors, because if the need is there to get an emergency commodity, then we need to do it, irregardless if there's reimbursement or not. But in almost all of these cases, in really 100% of these cases, these were all reimbursable by FEMA up to 75%. So every contract that we've put forward will be reimbursed through eligibility by FEMA at 75%. We have asked the White House for 100% for that, what we call emergency protective measures. That's all the front end stuff that we're talking about. And we're hoping that we hear something back soon about whether or not we can get that. We're hearing maybe it could be 90%. But until then, we know for a fact that when the president proclaimed the state a national disaster, major disaster, it was for 75% reimbursement. So we collectively look at all of these things. We're moving forward. And in the case of Blue Flame, the vetting that was done to the best of the degree possible in the time frames that they had working. And one of the checks and balances, of course, like any contract that we're working with, is in our collaboration with the bank. We typically, in state service, don't wire money to an entity. Well, we don't wire money to an entity, period, but to wire money to the entity prior to getting a commodity is really not in the normal process. And so the conditions and the circumstances were dictating a little different case. And we did not have to do them in all of these cases. In many of the cases, we felt like, you know, we vetted them through and the person was either too shady or it just did not seem like they could deliver. In the case of Blue Flame, as I mentioned, all the things I specifically read through, we felt like there was no derogatory. We've gone through that process, even to the point of even talking with 3M to try to go a different route to the last minute. But knowing full well that we were in desperate need of N95s, we opted to move forward with it. And one of the checks and balance that caught it was the bank, who recognized that there was a problem. The bank then notified both the treasurer and and the Department of General Services almost simultaneously. At which point, you know, that money was stopped and we pulled back, and you know, the rest is history. We didn't go that route. So we've tried to put more, you know, in real time expanded. We added from that point. We added an element that we typically don't do during disaster contracting, or really any contracting for that matter, and that is we brought in this team, this law enforcement team. Well, one of the roles of OES is, of course, we are also the Homeland Security Agency for the state, and so we leveraged all of the ability to use those methods and services, relationships with the U.S. Attorney. The U.S. Attorney at the same time, since there was widespread fraud going on across the country, the U.S. Attorney offices around the United States opened up task forces on fraud, and one here in Sacramento. I talked to the U.S. Attorney a couple of times, immediately offered to participate with us, as well as the FBI office in Sacramento. And that was also one of the things that we put in to vet each one of these then moving forward in this disaster.
Thank you. And just to put that in perspective for the members here and the public, how many no-bid contracts have been entered into in response to the crisis. And, you know, what are those contracts worth collectively? And we can get a general number there. I don't need you to pin it down exactly.
So I remember, I don't know for a fact. I do have, I think, online, I have Angela Schell from our Department of General Services at the State Operations Center. Angela, do you possibly know that answer?
Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So we have entered into approximately 180 purchase orders on behalf of the PPE effort at approximately $2.2 billion.
Does that include the BYD contract?
That does not include the full value of the BYD contract, no.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And my final question at this time for the director, and I think we're probably going to cover some of this. The warrant payment process, I think the treasurer is going to walk us through, at least it's in our packet here for the members to take a look at. Certainly works through the agency head, to the controller, to the treasurer. So it seems like it's designed in a way that's fairly robust with safety valves, so to speak. Are there lessons learned where you think the structure of that process needs additional steps? Or are you comfortable with these kind of outliers that we experienced, such as Blue Flame or others?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've thought a lot about this, and I think that, you know, I would say that there's always room for review and after action on every one of these disasters that give us an opportunity to reflect on how things could have operated differently or better. As I mentioned earlier, there's no linear pathway, and in this particular incident, that was really the case. I mean, this was about as asymmetrical in many ways as they get and the impacts. That said, I think that these were outliers, that the system that has been tried and true and we've used in many disasters works well. I think that every 120 years when you have a pandemic, maybe we ought to do a little extra. But I think that there will be, you know, certainly I really like some of the vetting, the enhanced vetting that we've put in place where maybe we vet contracts over a certain amount with this law enforcement group. We expand utilize better tools, more tools to be able to do that. But all that said, I do believe that these, I mean, we're talking about 10,000 or so contracts and vendors and things that we dealt with. And really there's been a couple of outliers that, you know, we caught, they were caught, and no money was lost. That doesn't mean that there's not always room for reflection.
Well, yeah, I think that's a fair answer, Director. And I would say caught by the bank after we've gone through several government steps, I think leaves us all with the question that maybe there's room for improvement there on our part in our process. Are you aware of anything outside of what we've all read in the news as it relates to Mike Gula and John Thomas, or who they are, or what their relationship, is there any relationship to the secretary? Is there any explanation of how we got that far along with those two individuals?
I have no idea who those two individuals are. What's their name?
What I have is Mike Gula and John Thomas, and I also am unaware of who they are, never heard of them, but wanted to ask the question.
Don't know. Can I just step back a second and say that part of the process you know, it's not all on the bank, but part of our overall process includes the bank. So look, this is not linear. We all are, you know, if we're one team, one fight on this, that we're all looking at this. And again, I think context plays into a lot of the situations that we're dealing with in the case. In the case of Blue Flame, it was context, and it was based upon everything that seemed to be legitimate given the circumstances and the timeframes that we were dealing with.
I think that's a fair point. I know we're going to have an opportunity to hear later today members from the treasurer and perhaps the controller. Are we hearing from the controller, Madam Chair? We're not. Well, maybe for a follow-up hearing there. Well, thank you for your time, Director. Appreciate all of your work, and please pass on our gratitude to those at your department.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Director, for joining us, and we appreciate all that you are doing to help us navigate this crisis.
Thank you all. Thank you.
All right, and with that, we are going to move to our second panelist, who is going to be Treasurer Ma on the video behind us.
Hi, can you see us? Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you. Thank you, Treasurer Ma, for joining us.
Great. So thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking everyone for sheltering at home and those who are working in essential services during these trying times. You are keeping us all safe and making it all work. Personally, I have felt the impacts of the crisis, both at work, at the Treasurer's office, as well as home, since my husband is a firefighter and first responder. I also want to thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing. This has been an unprecedented learning moment, or as you said, Madam Chair, a cautionary tale. But ultimately, I think this is a success story in that we have not lost any taxpayer money, as Director Gallarducci mentioned a number of times. I'd like to take a moment to introduce my office and what we do. I am your state treasurer, your banker, as prescribed in our Constitution in 1849. I oversee 3 divisions, chair 16 boards, commissions, and authorities, administer all outstanding bond committees, and am a voting member of about a dozen other financial boards. Over $2 trillion comes through our office every year. Presently, we are managing $100 billion in short-term investments for the state itself and more than 2,000 local governments. My office also oversees the sale of state bonds and actively manages about $90 billion in outstanding bonds. We are a small but mighty team of 420 professionals at the State Treasurer's Office. Overall, I am incredibly proud of how our state government is handling this crisis, and in particular, my team at the Treasurer's Office. California taxpayers must know that our government is working diligently toward keeping us safe, protecting the financial resources entrusted to us, and functioning as normally as possible under extremely difficult circumstances. Today's focus is on my centralized Treasury and Securities Management Division. There are about 6 people who work in this division. Since I started as treasurer on January 7th, 2019, I have found this division to be hardworking, ethical, high-functioning professionals dedicated to safeguarding the state's assets first and foremost. I'd like to introduce the director and the deputy director, who are both with me today, to answer any technical questions you may have. First, I have Mark Hariri, division director. He is a veteran of the State Treasurer's Office for more than 32 years of state service. Andre Rivera, deputy director, is also a veteran financial professional with more than 22 years of state service. As accountants, myself included, our job is to tick and tie. Every day, we balance all of the state's major accounts. We also ensure that there are adequate controls on payments from the state treasury. For example, 4 different individuals need to approve a wire transfer before it is released. In 1849, our forefathers established in our Constitution a separation of duties and responsibilities. The governor, the treasurer, and the state controller are all independent of one another because the functions are different for each of our agencies, and this separation is what enables better checks and balances. In our daily course of business, we work hand in glove with the Department of Finance and the State Controller's Office. COVID-19 has disrupted the way in which we live and do business. The first school closed on March 2nd here in Sacramento. The governor issued his stay-at-home order beginning March 19th. And after that day, every aspect of our lives have been impacted, including how our government runs. As a certified public accountant, certified in the state of California since 1992, my background in accounting, auditing, proper record keeping, and oversight has been put to good use and has pushed me and my team to higher levels of scrutiny since standard payment processes have been disrupted. After March 26th, I directed Andre Rivera to alert me whenever there is a large COVID-19 related wire transfer, and have taken it upon our office to vet these vendors the best that we can. From the handout you received called the Warrant Payment Process Illustrated, you will see that my office normally gets involved in steps 6 and 7 when a payee presents a warrant. Think of this as a normal check from a checking account for payment, and we verify that the warrant presented is on the list of issued and outstanding warrants prepared by the state controller. The other way we get involved is when a wire transfer is requested. In this instance, we have prescribed wire transfer protocols, also based on the state warrant process, that we follow before we release any money. As of today, my office has received 14 Public Records Act requests regarding 4 specific vendors, so I will address them now as they relate to my office. Number 1, the Blue Flame Medical LLC payment occurred on March 26th. The sense of urgency and panic, trying to get supplies, rushing to compete with the federal government and other states, created the need for expediency, which colored the normal processes in selecting and vetting approved vendors. After being reassured from the folks in step 1 to 3 in the warrant payment process, my office initiated the $457 million wire transfer through one of our depository banks, who flagged the transaction with concerns about possible fraudulent activity. Simultaneously, the Virginia bank that received the wire called Director Mark Hariri and informed him the account was opened a day before by a Washington, D.C.-based lobbyist, and the bank was not comfortable accepting this large wire transfer, which is why we clawed the money back, pending further confirmation of the legitimacy of the payments. The second vendor was Hitchens, Harrison and Company for ventilators. On April 3rd, we wired $8.7 million to their bank. That deal fell through since they couldn't secure the equipment, so they agreed to refund us back the money. On April 9th, we received $6.4 million, and on April 14th, we received the remaining $2.27 million. The third case is BYD. and the request to wire $495 million on April 10th as a down payment for the $1.1 billion total contract for surgical masks and N95 masks. In this instance, we specifically asked whether the proper vetting was done by the folks in step 1 to 3. After being assured it was, we wired the money to the named bank account. As of today, some of the surgical masks have arrived. However, the N95 masks have been delayed. BYD refunded us $247.5 million, which was deposited back in our bank with us last Friday, May 8th. And 4, the last vendor is Bear Mountain Development Company, LLC. According to the Los Angeles Times article on May 9th, this article said that DGS canceled the Bear Mountain contract on May 2nd. My office did not wire any money to any bank account, and we do not have any paperwork on this transaction. In closing, let me reiterate that the need to take immediate action and to produce immediate results impacted the normal, careful, and deliberate checks and balances processes that were in place. As we move forward as control agencies, we must continue to be disciplined, to adhere to the protocols, or develop new emergency protocols that we all agree upon. And lastly, during these times of crisis, we need to increase communication and cooperation amongst various departments, agencies, and with the executive branch, so we can be completely accountable to you as representatives of the people of California. I thank the governor for his leadership and steady hand in protecting our essential first-line defenders, workers, as well as those who are sheltering at home during these past 2 months. I am especially proud, however, of my team who stepped up during the past 8 weeks. We and I stand ready to be accountable and transparent in my duty as state treasurer. Thank you all. We will get through this stronger together.
Thank you, Treasurer Ma, for your detailed explication of some of the issues that have arisen, and also for the checks and balances that, as you said, were needed more than ever in the situations that we confronted in this rush to respond to COVID-19. Are there any questions from members? Mr. Gray? It's just up. Or...
Madam Treasurer, nice to see you, and thank you for your testimony. I'll pose the same question I posed to Director Goducci in the sense of kind of going forward, what do you see as an improved process, or do you think we have adequate protections? Obviously, several people have said this is an example of success, and in some sense it is, as in your capacity as treasurer in the treasurer's office, as part of that multi-step process, caught this, and of course, tax dollars were not lost. But are there additional improvements, be it in process or even communication between different entities within government, that could avoid these types of situations in the future?
Well, I think during times of crisis like this, like I said, more communication, better coordination is always the best way to go. Since March 19th, my office has a standing 8 a.m. call every single morning between our 3 divisions, just to talk about potential contracts that are coming down that we need to pay. I also have an investments division that invests the money. So if a large contract amount comes due, then my investments office needs to make sure that they have the adequate cash, because we invest all idle cash to make sure that we are making additional money for the state of California. So I would say just having the three control agencies collaborate or communicate on a daily basis, I think would definitely help so that we don't have any future issues like this that fall through the cracks.
And the key organizations being the Controller's Office, somebody in the Governor's Office, as well as the Treasurer's Office. Is that my understanding, correct?
Yes, usually the Department of General Services is the agency that manages all contracts, as well as requests the payment, vets the contracts, and then it goes to the Controller's Office for also vetting and the warrant process, and then it usually comes to us as like your banker, where someone presents the warrant to be paid, or in a wire transfer situation, then we get directly involved in making the wire transfer.
Thank you. And I'll also ask the same question I asked Director Goducci. Mike Gula and John Thomas, have you ever heard of them?
I have not heard of them.
Okay. And let me ask you this, Treasurer, since you had some experience previously serving in the state legislature, I think some of what we may be talking about going forward may not be, in fact, the process which ultimately was successful and ultimately did not result in taxpayer dollars being lost. But what are the other issues surrounding some of these incidents? And I think what may come under scrutiny or have some appropriate policy discussion is kind of the transparency around government affairs, whether it be, I know in this article they talk about political fundraisers and political consultants, but government affairs consultants, et cetera, being involved in state contracting. A lot of that part of state government isn't subject to the same disclosure rules that many of us are subject to. You know, for example, if somebody takes Mr. Medina to lunch and spends $12, that requires some level of reporting, right? Do you have an opinion on whether or not that's an area the legislature needs to dive into to perhaps strengthen the Political Reform Act or take some actions to make sure that those kinds of activities or the appropriate transparency exists around contracting?
Well, absolutely. We all have to file Form 700s, for example, every year to make sure that we are disclosing any potential conflicts of interest. So any measures that seek to create more transparency, especially in public contracting, I think is always the right course of action.
Thank you. And at this point, are you satisfied with I know you've mentioned some increased kind of protocols. Are you satisfied with the enhancements as far as the vetting process concerned going forward from this day forward during this crisis?
Like I said, we only are vetting the wire transfer requests because those are the only information or requests that come directly to us. If the controller issues a warrant, meaning sends a check to a payee, we don't necessarily know what checks or payments are going to. And we certainly don't see any of the contracts. So I'm kind of at the back end of the transactions. Would love to be more involved if the parties would like us, but currently the way the system works is we are really at the back end of the whole warrant process.
So perhaps my question's better directed to the controller at the time that we have the controller before us to ask those questions. And I've brought that up with the chairwoman that perhaps we need to invite the controller to be part of an additional hearing or have some communication. Doesn't have to be a hearing, could be more informal or a letter from the committee members or maybe from a couple of the committees. But seems like we should get some of those answers as well as the other agencies involved in contracting.
Well, yes, thank you for that suggestion, Mr. Gray. Let's work on that together.
That's all the questions I have at this time, so I'll yield to my colleagues.
Ms. Burke.
Hi, first I want to say I understand this has been a complicated time, and I really want to thank you for your part in the checks and balances system. And just back to Mr. Gray's question about communication. What does communication right now look like with you traditionally being required to just transfer the money? What is your traditional role in that communication, and what do you foresee in the future as the communication between you, DGS, or General Services, sorry, and the controller?
So I'm going to turn it over to an expert so I don't misspeak. So I'm going to have Andre come up and maybe just describe a little bit about some of the processes and how our office is involved in these transactions.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. So typically what happens as far as payments are concerned is a department obviously will have either a contract or a payment that needs to be made. And typically that will happen through them working with the controller and creating a claim schedule. That claim schedule going over to the state controller's office. The controller's office will then cut that warrant. Either one of two things will happen. Either the warrant will be mailed directly out to the vendor, and in which the treasurer says we will not have any direct correspondence. Or on the flip side of that is if the vendor is requesting a wire to be submitted, they will then forward that warrant to our office, and then the state controller's office sends that directly to us, and then we get wire transfer information from the department, and then we will in effect wire the monies based on the instructions from the department. And that's typically how we are involved. So the staff from the department will be in contact with our office, sending us wiring instructions, and we're communicating back and forth as far as the amount, the date that the warrant needs to go out, making sure that we have the warrant before we send out anything out of the state treasury. So the treasurer is not allowed to send anything outside of the treasury without a duly drawn warrant. And once we have that in hand, that's when we'll effect the transfer. So that's typically how we handle communication. But in this case, being that the process is typically that the vendor is vetted up front by the department, and then submitted to the controllers who does the back end accounting and making sure there's an appropriation, the money's in the fund correctly before they release a warrant. So all those checks and balances are typically there. In this case, we were relying upon the department doing the vetting, which they typically do, and again, we thought that's the process which would normally take. But we come to find out later that in this case, obviously the hurriedness of it, led that piece to be just a bit unchecked. And that's the part that, being in that part of the communication line, and strengthening that piece to make sure that the vetting is done up front. And I think it sounds as if OES and DGS has now done a different take on that, meaning they have now included the FBI, they have included other resources to help vet up front. I think that goes a long ways to satisfying some of that need that we took it from earlier point of not knowing exactly who the players were behind the scenes of each transaction. Now some of that vetting seems to be being done, and I think that's a very good thing.
Through the chair. So when you're asking for additional communication, you are not requesting that you become part of the vetting process, correct, any more than you traditionally are?
That is correct.
Okay, because your process did work in essence.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam Treasurer. I do have one more question. So thank you for that recommendation, which I think is very sound in terms of just the need for enhanced communication, particularly in this time of crisis when we are understandably working in an environment of panic and of desperation. So that's something that I hope we take forward, and I'm look forward to working with you to take that forward. Again, to Mr. Gray's, as Mr. Ray pointed out, you previously served here in this body with your legislature, with your hat on as a legislator. Are there other places where you think, gosh, now that I've got this vantage point as the state treasurer in this moment of crisis, here are some places where perhaps our laws need to be strengthened to further protect California taxpayers?
Well, I think the necessary checks and balances have been in place between the control agencies, but like everybody alluded to, things were happening very quickly, just competing with the federal government and other states for the PPE really shortened or curtailed the normal vetting processes and checks and balances that usually happen. So now that I think things have calmed down a little bit, and Department OES Director Gulajuchi has formed a larger committee to vet the vendors, I think that is a very good thing. That should happen. And on our end, for every wire transfer request that comes to us, we are also doing the vetting, because these vendors are new to us. They have not been in the system for a long time, and so we are also taking that extra step and due diligence.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your perspective, and for all the work that you do for California and for California taxpayers.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And all right, now we are going to move on to our last panel. I believe, is it on the phone or is it going to be on another television? We're going to be joined by Helen Kirstein, who is the Principal Fiscal and Policy Analyst from the Legislative Analyst's Office.
So good afternoon, Chair and members. My name is Helen Kirstein with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate today and allowing me to participate remotely. We just have a few comments that we wanted to provide to the committee today. As you've heard in the previous panels, COVID-19 really has emerged as a public health emergency that's of vast scale and really unprecedented in a lot of ways, and then created really an unprecedented need for goods and services such as PPE. And the administration has moved very quickly to enter into those contracts to secure those goods and services. We think this makes sense, but the situation really has created some oversight challenges from our perspective for the legislature. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those challenges in my remarks today. So first, there really, from our perspective, are some oversight and accountability challenges that are kind of inherent in the special processes that are in place during disasters and emergencies. So there are two processes I want to talk about very quickly. The first is contracting, and we've talked quite a bit about this already today. But as you've heard, state contracts are exempt from the typical contracting rules during emergency situations. So typically, there are rules requiring competitive bidding, securing multiple bids, public advertising before the state enters into contracts. And this is really to try to ensure that the state gets the lowest price and that it's a fair competition to get the state's business. However, these rules can be waived during an emergency. And of course, there's an important rationale for this, as we've heard, and this is really a life or death kind of situation, and these procurements need to happen very quickly. And so sort of in the trade-off between how robust the vetting is and how quickly the state moves, that we sort of go on the, towards quicker and a little bit less robust than we would with a typical procurement. And there's certainly a reason for that. But it does mean that the typical guardrails that the legislature has, that typically give the legislature confidence the contracts are going to be fair and that everything is going to go as it should, are weakened because sort of the process is a little bit less robust. And of course, we've talked a little bit about that today and heard quite a bit about some of the ways it can go. It can be problematic as well. So the second kind of piece is the funding approach. So the funding approach is also different in emergency situations. So typically, departments have to seek appropriations from the legislature through the budget process. And this gives the legislature a really good opportunity to seek information on how funding will be spent, on the procurement process that will be used, and any other information that the legislature feels it needs to decide whether to provide the funds. However, during emergencies, the administration can use some other processes. In particular, it can access the disaster response emergency operations account. And it doesn't need to go through the typical legislative appropriation process for this. So it basically can access this account, which is a sub-account of the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties, which is part of the state's reserve account. without prior notification or authorization from the legislature. So there's a requirement, after the fact, basically, that the administration notify the legislature through the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, but up front, there's no notification requirement or a requirement that the administration ask for an appropriation. So this makes it a little bit more challenging for the legislature. And then I did want to point out that I think that the challenges were sort of exacerbated by the unprecedented nature of the COVID-19 emergency. And the director of OES talked a little bit about this, but most emergencies, most kinds of disasters happen quickly. There are things like floods and wildfires that happen over a relatively short period of time. There's a relatively quick response, a defined geographic area within a state. COVID-19, the response could be very prolonged. It could be, over a year, perhaps, and it certainly affects not only the state, but sort of worldwide. And so this really increases the scale and the length of time over which emergency procurements take place, and that really raises the stakes related to effective oversight. And these are, as we've heard, these departments are entering into extremely large contracts, hundreds of millions of dollars, over $1 billion in some cases. And so these emergency processes that aren't quite as robust, and again, there's a reason for that, but it makes it challenging when you're procuring these very large contracts, a lot of money is at stake. And so really, it creates kind of a tough situation. And then finally, I wanted to highlight the issue of transparency. And we did want to sort of highlight that, particularly for these COVID-19 contracts, transparency has been a challenge. And I think part of that has been the reasons that I mentioned. I mean, it's been, and the reasons that were discussed previously in the previous panels regarding, the nature of the emergency, how quickly folks had to act, how sensitive this information in many cases was. But with that said, while some information was provided through notification to the legislature, for example, when the administration was accessing the Disaster Recovery Emergency Operations Account or accessing the specific appropriations the legislature made through what's known as the Section 36 process, in many cases, there were significant gaps with the information provided to the legislature for an extended period of time, often several weeks. And there were, in some cases, multiple requests made for this information. So one example is the recent BYD contract, which has been discussed at some length. It's been pretty difficult for the legislature to get basic information on this contract in a timely manner. Some of the kinds of information that folks were seeking from our office, as well as other legislative staff and I believe members as well, included things like the cost and volume of purchases, key terms of the contract, or initially who the vendor was, the plans for how those masks would be allocated, for example, to different types of user groups, and really what portion of the identified need would be filled by that contract. So it was challenging to get that information. Ultimately, the administration did provide the contract. I think it took roughly a month to get that information on the contract. And that did answer a number of those questions, but it's been a pretty slow process. Additionally, press reports indicate that there are a number of other large contracts, and we've heard today, actually, the director spoke about some of those. So on that point, we understand that the administration has just today provided some additional information about these contracts. We still haven't received an official notification, and so that references these contracts, for example, Section 36 or Disaster Response Emergency Operations Account notification. So we're still trying to crosswalk exactly what the funding authority is for these contracts and exactly kind of how they all fit together. And we understand that this information will be made public and put on the website once it's sort of appropriately redacted. But it's taken some time to get this information, as I said, and that's just coming in now. And I think these contracts have been in place for some time. So we do think that without basic kind of timely information on contracts, it is particularly difficult for the legislature to ensure accountability and to perform its oversight function. That's a critical role for the legislature, and the legislature has a very important role in oversight over, in these cases, billions of dollars. And so, it's a challenge. The administration is in a very difficult position as well. Of course, they're trying to move quickly. Of course, they're trying to protect the state and make sure we actually get all of this PPE. So they're in a very difficult position, but the legislature also really has an interest in getting timely, consistent information on these contracts to make sure that the funding is appropriately spent. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, so thank you for sharing that perspective, and I think you make a really good point that some of the shifts that we typically see in an emergency situation, the stakes here are so much higher because we know, A, this is a statewide emergency, and B, this is a protracted situation with no end in sight. So that point is very well taken. I have a couple of questions, but let me first see any other members with questions. Okay. So let me just ask you a couple of things. So I believe that I know that you had raised and you just shared with us some of your concerns, particularly around transparency. You know, are there any specific changes that you would like to see implemented in order to enhance oversight, accountability, and transparency as we move forward through this crisis?
So I think this is something that we're still working on and still thinking about. I think COVID-19 has really highlighted some of these challenges in a way that hadn't been the case before. So this is something that we're sort of doing some ongoing work on. So at this point, we don't have specific recommendations, but I would sort of give you a couple things maybe to think about. I think any kind of change, of course, there's going to be trade-offs, and often the trade-off is maybe things are a little bit slower, or maybe there's a little bit more risk in terms of the deal falling through, but then maybe there's some more guardrails or some more transparency. And so we'll really have to do a little bit more due diligence to fully understand all of those trade-offs before we provide a full set of recommendations. But just a couple things to think about. You could change the procurement process itself and have some additional measures in there. It sounds like the administration is already working on some of those things, incorporating some review from law enforcement, for example. And so those are good steps. But of course, additional steps could be, or additional processes could be in place, or additional communication, as the treasurer mentioned as well. So those are the types of things you could do on the procurement side. Again, they're probably trade-offs, and the more you add sort of additional steps, the more it can slow things down. So it's not necessarily an easy fix. There could be changes on the funding side that could be considered. For example, as I mentioned, the Disaster Response Emergency Operation Account has been used to fund some of these activities, and there isn't a requirement for advance notification from the legislature. And so there could be some thought to whether it'd be appropriate to make some changes there, or provide a little bit more in terms of additional information to the legislature on those types of notifications. And just in general, one of the kinds of things that could be considered is just adding more transparency for the legislature after the fact, so that, trying to increase the timeliness or amount of information that's provided to the legislature, particularly on large contracts. That could be something that's considered. So, as we heard, there are a very large number of contracts. I think DGS spoke to 180 just for the PPE, and there are additional contracts that the state has entered into for non-PPE types of activities related to COVID-19. So really the scale is very large. And if it's a really small procurement, maybe that's less of a concern, perhaps. But especially with these very large procurements where a lot of funding is at stake, and that can really have big budgetary implications too for the state. If something goes awry and we lose the money and then don't reimburse us, for example, and that's sort of the worst case scenario, and that would be very difficult, particularly given that some of these contracts are very, very large. So thankfully that hasn't happened, and as we heard, the state has been able to get back all of its funds. But I think those are the kinds of things that we want to certainly make sure don't happen, and we want to make sure that those funds, especially when there's a large dollar value at stake, are really spent in a fair way as well. So I think, those, you could focus on certain types of contracts as well. So those are just a few things to think about, just a few kinds of options. Again, they all have trade-offs. We haven't yet sort of identified some specific recommendations, but I think that those are the types of areas that the legislature could consider as it moves forward, and is trying to weigh how to best address this in case we hope we won't hope we don't have another situation like COVID-19 for a very extended period of time. But even COVID-19 and this response could go on for some period of time, and we might have additional big contracts in store. So it is worth, I think, quite a bit of time thinking about how do we make sure this process works as well as it can.
Well, Ms. Kirstein, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being patient with us on this, and thanks for sharing your perspective. And we'll look forward to continuing to work with you again as we move forward. And with that, I think what we'll go ahead and do is open this up for public comment. As I had said, today we have a few options for public comment here in the room, via phone and via email. So if there's any members of public in the room who would like to speak right now, please raise your hand and I'll ask you to approach the microphone. Let's see, I don't think we have anyone. All right. Okay, so for telephone comment, we will be using a moderated telephone service through which any member of the public can provide their comments. The call-in number for this hearing is 877-692-8957. This is the number that is on the website as well as on your TV screen if you're watching the hearing now. The access code to dial in is 242-6237. And if you're calling in, the operator on the line will give you instructions on how to be placed in the queue. All right, and we are also accepting public comment via email. You can email committee staff your comments. Their email addresses are listed on our committee website. All right, moderator, do we have anyone on the line for public comment?
We'll check. Ladies and gentlemen on the phone lines, if you have a question or comment, please press 1, then 0 at this time. An operator will provide your line number and provide you further instructions. Once again, from the phones, it's 1, then 0. Put yourself in the queue. Being allowed a few moments. There are no public comments from the phone lines at this time. Please continue.
All right. Thank you, members, for joining us. Thank you again to all of our panelists for participating. I think this was a valuable and instructive conversation. Today, in a crisis, and I think always, our number one goal is to ensure that we are ensuring that we are spending our taxpayers' dollars efficiently and effectively, that we have robust vetting processes in place to protect California's taxpayers. And that's, as I said, our goal in a crisis and our goal always. Thank you for joining us. And with that, we are adjourned.
Ladies and gentlemen, it does conclude your conference for today.